one of the other tests that was administered by Dr. Samuels was the MCMI. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
I'm going to show you exhibit number 541. Was this provided to you by Dr. Samuels?
Yes.
And if we take a look down here at the bottom, it does talk about PTSD. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then it talks about a 10, and then a 69, and a 69. First of all, with regard to this 69, if we go up to the top, it talks about an unadjusted base rate score. What does that mean?
Statistically, they just adjust it, so we usually go off of the final base rate score.
So does that mean anything, or do we really need to, if not ignore it, look to the final?
Look at the final base rate score.
And in this case, what was the final score?
For PTSD, it was 69.
And then if we go to the next page, it talks about base rate scores. What are base rate scores?
Just symptom presentation, symptom endorsement.
So, but what's the importance, for example, of having a 60, a 75, 85? What does that mean?
Well, in any psychological test, there has to be some sort of threshold that has been designated through research that essentially tells us as psychologists, if it's past this threshold, it's meaningful. If it's not past that threshold, it's not clinically relevant.
So, for example, let's say that we were talking about PTSD, and we have a score that's between 60 and 75. Could I or you, as a psychologist, say, well, you know what? Yeah, that's what we have in this score, but because I've been practicing for 35 years, I'm going to ignore that. And because of my experience, I'm going to look at the number between 60 and 75 and say that that's indicative of PTSD. Is that the way it works?
No.
Why not?
Well, again, there's a threshold that's set forth by research, and you follow the threshold. It's identified in the manual. You certainly don't pretend like the score isn't there if it's below 75, but it's not telling us that it's clinically significant, which after 75, it becomes clinically significant.
And by clinically significant, that means that...
Right, again, the threshold on this test should have been, as she said, 75. What Samuels received was a 69. Martinez alluding fact, well, Samuels is just ignoring the numbers here. Again, really going on the attack. We've hit pause, we'll hit play.
Significant, that means that that's an indication, correct?
Yes.
In and of itself, does that mean that if the person has an elevated score between 75 and 85 under the PTSD marker, that they automatically have PTSD?
No, that's just one data point that's then incorporated with all the rest of the aspects of the evaluation.
And this is called the Milan or Milan also?
Milan.
And with regard to this Milan test, if it's been scored once, is there any reason and the scoring, if it's done by a computer, let's assume it's done by a computer, is there, and that doesn't have human error like the PDS, you can tell. Can you tell us whether or not it was scored? This is exhibit number 550. Can you tell us whether or not it was scored manually or whether it was scored by a computer?
I would make the assumption that it's manual because it's handwritten.
And with regard to this, the MCMI, by looking at this, can you tell us whether or not this was done by a computer or manually?
Looks like a typical computer printout.
If, for example, if this is done by a computer, do you see a need to go back and rescore this thing?
No.
Is there any reason to suspect or any reason that you can think of to go ahead and rescore this thing once a computer has done it the first time?
Only for the reasons that I highlighted before.
And what are those reasons?
That there was some sort of error that was made or that the data was being manipulated.
And if we take a look at Exhibit 535. Ms. DeMarte, this MCMI score or test, first of all, do you know what norming is? What does that mean?
Norming is just a reference group. It allows us, whenever there's a test taker, we can compare their test scores against the average normative reference group population.
This MCMI, this test, do you know what population it was normed against?
Yes.
And what was it normed against?
It's normed against what's called a clinical population. These were individuals who were seeking treatment or I believe it was treatment in an outpatient setting or inpatient setting. So these were individuals who are already identified as having a psychological disorder.
So if you are looking at the results that we have in this case, for example, in exhibit number 553, are they being compared against the non-symptomatic population, or are they being compared against a population that has already been determined to have some sort of mental health issue?
A population that's been determined to have mental health issues.
So if we're trying to take a look at an individual such as Ms. Arias, in your opinion, why would we need to look at her behavior in comparison with somebody who has psychiatric issues, or has mental health issues already? Is that a problem, or is that something that you can do?
Well, I've used the MCMI myself before when I was working at the state hospital, and I found it to be very helpful because at that time I was working with individuals who were already deemed to have a psychological disorder. In a situation like this, my job was to determine whether there was a psychological disorder that was present. And the way that we do that is we look at symptom patterns and see how do they differentiate from the average person. So because of that, I would choose not to use a test like this.
And you have used this test in the past, correct?
Yes.
Now, are you familiar with the materials and the approach taken by Alyce Laviolette?
Yes.
What approach did she take with regard to this case in the evaluation?
She took a different approach, a much more subjective approach, in that there was no testing that was conducted. There was no report that was written, so there was nothing, excuse me, there was nothing for me to read, any report that she wrote, any test data so that I can compare.
And so when you say that this was a much more subjective approach, is there something out there, for example, you were talking about these tests involving Ms. Karp and Dr. Karp and Dr. Samuels, you were told about these tests that you could actually run and compare yourself, right?
That's correct.
But with regard to Ms. Laviolette, is there any objective way that you could go back and look at something to say, oh, I see, this is how she reached the result, and I've been able to verify that result?
No, there was no report, there was no test data.
So what is it that she did then?
What she did is review.
Objection, experience, relevance, speculation, lack of knowledge.
Approach.
Alyce Laviolette, were you provided any materials that she created, such as notes?
Objection has to be answered.
Overruled.
I was provided with notes.
Were you also provided with an interview that she conducted in November of 2012 with the prosecutor? The audio tape.
Oh, the audio tape, yes.
And did you review that audio tape?
Yes.
And did you take a look at the notes that were provided to you?
Yes.
Did you, for example, the audio tape, did she discuss the approach that she took in this case?
Yes.
And with regard to her approach that she discussed, what was your understanding of the approach that she took?
She interviewed Ms. Arias and she looked at records.
And with regard to the approach as a psychologist, what is your opinion as to the validity of that approach?
Objection, foundation.
Overruled.
There's a big piece of missing data there, which is giving tests.
Okay, and so what would the tests have done?
It adds another objective measure.
And in this case, isn't that at all, correct?
Can you say that again?
There isn't any testing that she did, correct?
That's correct.
But how would that be important? to Alyce Laviolette's approach.
It's another,
Objection, Judge, lack of foundation with regard to domestic violence.
Overruled. You may continue.
it's another piece of data that would be able to be incorporated so that it's not just information that's coming directly from Ms. Arias in a clinical interview.
And for example, in this case, are you familiar with the fact that there have been changing stories with regard to the defendant and events involved in this case?
Yes.
If that were the case, that there are this changing stories about the events, does that add anything, or does that raise a red flag to you with regard to the approach that Alyce Laviolette used?
Absolutely. If there's inconsistencies with Ms. Arias's report, then we have to be concerned about which information that she gives us is accurate or not. So the more data points that we have to make a final conclusion, the more accurate it will be.
Ma'am, in Exhibit 600, one of the things that was discussed, for example, with Alyce Laviolette was, and it's a instant message between Reagan Housley and Travis Alexander, and according to Alyce Laviolette, that was on May 19th of 2008. In it, Mr. Alexander indicates that he is extreme.
Objection beyond the scope. Beyond rebuttal.
Overruled.
He indicates that he is extremely afraid of the defendant because of her stalking behavior. And one of the things that Alyce Laviolette told us was that, well, she didn't believe him. And she gave her reasons for that. Do you see anything in her approach, the approach that you are familiar with, do you see anything in her approach that would give her or you or anybody the ability to go behind the words and pass on the truthfulness or untruthfulness of that statement?
Objection is characterized as Ms. Laviolette's testimony.
Overruled. You may answer the question.
This is one piece of data that can be used as objective, and it can be used amongst with everything else that is collected. There's nothing that you can say it's in written word. It was given. You use it as a piece of data.
And so saying that...
All right, got to hit pause in the middle of that point there, but it's a big one. Travis wrote, he's afraid of Jody's stalking behavior. This witness is saying Alyce Laviolette should not have overridden that, should have taken it at face value. We've hit pause.
And so saying that you don't believe it, for example, her saying that she didn't believe it, and you...
Objection is characterized as the testimony.
The jury is directed to recall the evidence provided previously in this trial by the witness. You may continue.
With regard to whether or not this is something to be believed, does her approach lend itself to being able to make an assessment of when somebody is being truthful or untruthful just by looking at the written word, the objective data?
What that does is it changes objective data into subjective data.
And what do you mean that it changes it over to subjective data? What does that mean?
That if you were to give that same written word to somebody else, they may subjectively interpret it different rather than looking at it for what it is. If the words say something, that's what the words mean.
And so if you have the changing of the data, of the objective data, morphing over to subjective data, what does that tell you under this approach, or does that tell you anything about the ultimate conclusion or opinion that is rendered based on this subjective interpretation of the words?
Objection, lack of foundation.
Approach, please.